advocacy with the Russians to make them either confront the problem, or if they continued to deny it, for there to be attendant consequences in our bilateral relations. I made the point about bilateral relations with Rumyantsev and Koptev on April 30, 2002 in Moscow, which neither of them liked hearing. Bush did raise the matter of Iran with Russian President Putin right before signing the Treaty of Moscow, and they were asked about Iran at the press conference afterward. Putin denied that Russia was doing anything untoward, or anything different at least from what we were doing in supporting the construction of light water reactors in North Korea, which I thought was a telling point against us. As we were milling around, Bush expressed disappointment with Putin's answer. The problem with Bushehr was that once the reactor became operational, Iran could reprocess enough plutonium from spent fuel rods for 60 nuclear weapons, if they decided to seize all the nuclear material on the reactor's premises. Requiring Iran to ratify the additional protocol, which gave the IAEA enhanced inspection rights, was little protection against a determined cheater like Iran. Moreover, Russian insistence on a take-back agreement was also not sufficient, given the time that the spent fuel had to stay in cooling ponds until it could actually be transported. Further meetings in September, October, and November were unproductive, and by this point the looming war in Iraq began to choke out other subjects with the Russians. Now, however, the focus began to shift from Russia to Iran directly. When IAEA Director General Mohammed El-Baradi visited Iran in mid-February 2003, he was shown an operating 164 centrifuge cascade, and he and the IAEA team saw components for up to 1,000 additional centrifuges. Moreover, Iran also revealed it had received uranium hexafluoride, the gas used in the enrichment process, from China years earlier, the prior concealment of which obviously violated Iran's safeguards agreement. The disclosures raised more questions than they answered. This was powerful information, dramatically corroborating what we already believed, and only increased my level of concern. I thought Iran might be employing a bait-and-switch approach, disclosing part of its nuclear program, thereby hoping to divert attention from other activities. Deputy Secretary of State Rich Armitage's reaction when I briefed him was right on point. We caught them. I wanted to pursue Iran in the IAEA Board of Governors, or BOG, as accurate an acronym as there ever was, using Iran's continued intransigence, which I fully expected to move the entire matter to the Security Council, where we could try to impose sanctions. Little did I know the process would last over 3 years. I first raised this approach at a Paris Perm 3 meeting, the US, UK, and France, on April the 8th, well ahead of when we would need to start a lobbying campaign in the IAEA board, but their initial reaction was tepid. Russia was also not enthusiastic and still not excessively concerned, although there was one positive sign. Rumyantsev came to Washington on April 10 bearing a letter from Putin to Bush stating in part, "We share the concern of the U.S. about Iran's intentions to create production of their own nuclear fuel, for which, in our opinion, there will be no economic necessity in the foreseeable future." On May 5th, I met again with Rumyantsev in Moscow. All the work we had been doing began to pay off, as he confirmed that Russia simply would not ship fresh fuel to Bushehr until the questions about Iran's nuclear programs were resolved. In addition, my Russian counterpart, Georgy Mamyedov, told me, Putin himself has largely concluded that Iran has a nuclear weapons program. I wanted to refer Iran to the Security Council at the June 2003 board meeting of the International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA. If we couldn't do it then, we could at least lay the basis to do so in September. Reports from IAEA headquarters in Vienna were encouraging, because Iran was having no success in convincing other delegations its program was peaceful. After one question-and-answer session in early May, the Mexican IAEA Perm Rep said to our delegation, "There must have been something wrong with the translation today because nothing the Iranians said made any sense." Unfortunately, China was less forthcoming. The United States was sanctioning one after another of China's military-industrial complex companies, such as Norinco, for providing ballistic missile equipment and technology to Iran in violation of our statutes. Bushehr, Norinco, and other commercial arrangements made clear that neither Russia nor China yet fully understood, as we did, that profits from short-term business deals did not nearly make up for the risks inherent in proliferating sensitive technologies to Iran and other rogue states. Unfortunately, in early August, a plan by the United Kingdom, Germany, and France, the EU3 as we came to call them, emerged that would derail our efforts on Iran for the next 3.5 years. It was inspired in part by British Foreign Secretary Jack Straw's efforts to carve out his own niche separate from Blair's dominance of foreign policy, and also by Franco-German desires to show that the European Union, or EU, could handle Iran differently from the way those unilateralist Bush administration cowboys had handled Iraq. If they could stop Iran's nuclear program by diplomacy, they felt, in effect, they could justify their opposition to the Iraq War. Britain went along, in my view, to burnish its Euroid credentials and to show it was not a complete poodle of the United States, as many critics described Blair's relationship with Bush. The EU3 wrote to Iran proposing that it give up its nuclear program in exchange for unspecified but implicitly generous carrots from them. I didn't like the idea, but Powell would not stand in its way when Straw raised it with him. Fortunately, or so I thought, Iran's response was complete mush, which I hope would be enough to persuade the Euroids that they were not going to accomplish anything substantial. Unfortunately, on September 2, 2003, the EU3 foreign ministers decided to write back to Iran saying, essentially, your letter didn't answer our letter, which I thought was a complete waste of time. When the IAEA board convened on September the 8th, El-Baradi actually did reveal some of what the IAEA inspectors had found at Iran's Calais electric facility, namely evidence of uranium hexafluoride enriched up to a 5% concentration of U-235, basically reactor-grade level, demonstrating enrichment activity. Nonetheless, the tough resolution we sought from the IAEA was under assault. The final flap, a typical UN battle, was whether we continued to insist that the IAEA reach definitive conclusions about Iran at its November meeting, a code phrase for referral to the Security Council, or whether we would accept Russian wording simply mentioning conclusions, thus reducing it to mush. I thought we had already conceded too much. It transpired that when Ken Brill, our ambassador to the IAEA, told others of our position, the board immediately decided to break for 2 hours for lunch, this being a UN agency after all. By 10:30 a.m. Washington time, word came back from Vienna that Russia and the non-aligned countries had collapsed. The phrase definitive conclusions would stay in, and chaos would not engulf Vienna. This was the kind of definitive win we could achieve much more often in our negotiations if our diplomats stood firm. I wanted to turn immediately to the November IAEA board, determined to do all the necessary preparatory work, mostly in member governments' capitals rather than in Vienna, to get a Security Council referral. However, the EU3 gobsmacked those plans, as the Brits say, by sending Iran another letter that went much further than the others, basically offering nuclear reactor technology if Iran effectively renounced its nuclear program by ceasing uranium enrichment activities. Central to EU3 thinking was that such a cessation would prevent Iran from making progress on the nuclear front, thus allowing negotiations to proceed at whatever pace they might without increasing the risk of Iran's achieving nuclear weapon status. Ironically and disastrously, the renewed EU3 effort produced exactly the opposite result. Over the next 3.5 years, it gave Iran precisely what it needed most: time to overcome the difficulties of mastering the nuclear fuel cycle. It brought the EU3 and the United States little in return except the greater risk posed by more advanced Iranian nuclear weapons and ballistic missile programs. EU3 representatives returned to Tehran despite our objections. I reached my British counterpart, William Ehrman, in Brussels on October the 19th, right after his return, and he said things had not gone off the rails, but neither had they advanced very far along the rails. The Iranians swore up and down they were fully cooperating with the IAEA, which we both knew was flatly untrue, and planned to sign the additional protocol shortly. Not surprisingly, Straw, French Foreign Minister Dominique de Villepin, and German Foreign Minister Joschka Fischer, whom Powell was calling the Three Tenors, couldn't resist the bait, and off they flew to Tehran on October 21st. I tried to persuade Powell to call Straw to stop the trip, but he declined. Straw was accompanied to Tehran by John Soares, the new UK political director, who, like Straw, decided that making a deal with Iran was his holy grail. Sure enough, Soares reported afterward, Iran agreed to everything from signing the additional protocol to suspending uranium enrichment to full cooperation with the IAEA. In his press conference, however, Hassan Rouhani, the head of Iran's National Security Council, was more accurate regarding suspending enrichment. We voluntarily chose to do it, which means it could last for 1 day or 1 year. It depends on us. As long as Iran thinks that this suspension is beneficial for us, it will continue, and whenever we don't want it, it will end. What wonderful candor. Too bad the Europeans couldn't match it. Needless to say, the EU3 felt it was unnatural not to seek a resolution at the IAEA. On November the 17th, Rice met with Fisher in Washington and argued strongly that the EU3 draft was so weak it would encourage Iranian non-compliance. She pushed to refer Iran to the Security Council, but there was no chance given what the EU3 had done and their desire not to upset Iran. At the IAEA, Australia, Canada, and Japan gave up on the EU3, whom state careerists were now calling the T3 for Tehran 3, and introduced their own resolution stating flatly that Iran was in non-compliance with its safeguards agreement. Yet another effort at a trigger mechanism to force action on a Security Council referral at the next IAEA meeting. Within days of the IAEA board resolution, Iran accepted the EU3 terms, or so the EU3 thought. For example, Iran finally signed the additional protocol, which induced euphoria in Europe and parts of state, even though Iran never ratified it and in any event didn't abide by it. By mid-February, despite overwhelming evidence of Iran's violations, which the EU3 didn't dispute, they were still absorbed in trying to save the Paris Agreement, trying to find fixes that could resuscitate the deal. The EU3 political directors did strike another deal with Iran in Brussels in late February, with just as many holes as the previous one. With Powell's agreement, I sent a very detailed letter to explain to the EU3 what was wrong with both the original deal and the latest modification. Powell told Bush about the letter to the EU3, and Bush thought it was a good idea. Once delivered, the letter made the EU3 most unhappy. Fisher called Powell to complain, and according to the reporting cable, Powell said he no longer had any concerns about the EU3 Iran deal, giving the impression he disagreed with the letter, which expressed those very concerns at length. This was amazing. Powell said simply at his regular 8:30 a.m. staff meeting the next morning that we should try to get a tough resolution at the March IAEA board meeting, but that he didn't plan any further involvement. I filled in the NSC's Bob Joseph on this, and he was speechless, which was close to my reaction. I departed for London to meet with William Ehrman and John Sawyers, the two Brits working on this matter, on March the 2nd, urging them that the EU3 had to have a point at which they realized the deal with Iran had failed. What would it take to convince the EU3 of Iran's duplicity? Weapons design information? Evidence of a previously undisclosed enrichment facility? Yes to both questions, said Ehrman and Sawyers. The calendar then brought us to the March 8 IAEA board meeting, at which chaos reigned. Iran's Rouhani said publicly, "We told the EU3 that if you don't fulfill your promise, everything will return to day one," which looked to be exactly where Iran was headed. Imagine my delight, therefore, when Iran came through for us just before a June 24, 2004 House of Representatives hearing, with letters to the EU3 withdrawing from the February agreement, saying it intended to resume the manufacture, assembly, and testing of centrifuge equipment. I opened the hearing with this late-breaking news, thus guaranteeing maximum coverage due to Iran's ever-exquisite timing. The Iranian parliament was also indicating there was no chance it would ever ratify the additional protocol, significantly undercutting the notion that Iran had at any time been serious about these negotiations. The EU3 sent a letter in response that contained one crucial sentence: "We will only be able to make progress in the context of a full suspension." My main point was to refer Iran to the Security Council at the September IAEA